My husband stood in front of our kids and told me his mistress made him a better father, so I spent 6 months quietly building the case that would destroy him in court. He said it like he was explaining the weather, not during a fight, not in a moment where heat makes people say things they don't mean. We were standing in the kitchen on a Sunday afternoon in late October, and Lance looked directly at me and said, "Gloria is more important than the kids right now because she makes me the man who can provide for them." Jake was 10 feet away. He was sitting at the breakfast bar with a bowl of cereal he'd stopped eating. Mia was on the couch in the next room, close enough to hear everything. She was 8 years old and she had her knees pulled up to her chest, and she was very, very still. Lance walked out of the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water. He checked his phone. I stood there for a moment. My hands were flat on the counter. I looked at Jake. He was staring at his cereal. He didn't look up. I went upstairs. I sat on the edge of the bed. I took out a notepad, the small one I'd started keeping in the nightstand 3 weeks earlier, and I wrote that sentence down 3 times, word for word. I wrote the date next to it. I wrote the time. I noted that Jake had been in the room. I noted that Mia had been on the couch. Then I closed the notepad. I didn't cry. That surprised me. I think I was done crying by then. I had moved, without fully realizing it, into a different mode entirely. Something quieter, something that had edges. That was the moment I stopped trying to save my marriage and started building a case. I need to go back a little. Not all the way. Just far enough for this to make sense. Lance and I met in 2009 at a company happy hour in downtown Chicago. He was 31 and confident in a way that I found magnetic at the time. I was 28 and working in project coordination at a mid-sized architecture firm. He was in commercial real estate development. We were introduced through a mutual friend, and he asked me to dinner the following Friday. We got married in June of 2012. Mia was born in February of 2015. Jake came in September of 2017. For the first several years, the marriage was normal. Not perfect, nothing is, but functional, warm even. Lance worked long hours, but he was proud of his work. He coached Jake's soccer team for 1 season, poorly, but enthusiastically. He came to Mia's school performances. He grilled on weekends. He called his mother every Sunday. I was working part-time by then, a flexible arrangement I'd negotiated after Jake was born, doing project management consulting from home 2 or 3 days a week. I was the one who handled school pickups, doctor appointments, permission slips. That division had always been unspoken, but functional. The first thing I noticed was the Thursdays. In the spring of 2022, Lance started coming home late on Thursdays. Not dramatically late, just past 9, 10 o'clock, when before he'd been home by 7. He said they were strategy meetings at the office, Q2 planning, then Q3 planning, then ongoing leadership alignment. I accepted it. The explanations were plausible. The firm was expanding. Then the cologne started. Before the Thursday nights, Lance wore cologne maybe twice a week, casual. By May of 2022, he was coming home from these meetings smelling like he'd just applied it fresh, not faded the way it does after 8 hours. Fresh, concentrated. I noticed it and said nothing. I told myself it meant nothing. In early June, Mia mentioned, casually over dinner, that Daddy had given her art teacher a ride from school. She said Daddy seemed really happy. She said they were laughing a lot. "Which art teacher?" I asked. "The pretty one," Mia said. "Ms. Voss." I asked Lance about it that evening. I kept my voice even. I said I just thought it was a little unusual. He looked at me like I had said something embarrassing. He said I was projecting. He said he was just being neighborly, that Ms. Voss lived near his office and it had been raining. He said, "This is exactly why I don't tell you things." He went to his office and shut the door. I apologized the next morning. I don't know why. I think I wanted to believe the explanation badly enough to pay whatever it cost to keep it. That was foreshadowing. I see it clearly now. Not just the lie, but the move, the immediate reversal, the way he made my question the problem instead of his answer. That pattern would repeat itself with increasing sophistication for the next 5 months. By August, I had connected enough of the pieces to know there was something wrong. I just didn't know the shape of it yet. The Thursday nights had multiplied. There were now also Saturday golf trips. Lance had taken up golf in his 20s and played occasionally, so this wasn't implausible. And Sunday investor brunches with clients he never named. Jake asked around this time why Daddy never came to soccer games anymore. He asked it the way kids ask questions they already know the answer to, quietly, without looking at you. Lance's response when I relayed it to him was, "Making money is more important than watching kids run around a field." I remember where I was standing when he said that. I was at the kitchen sink. The window above it looks out over the backyard, and I remember focusing on a bird feeder we'd hung out there the previous spring. I kept looking at it while he spoke. I didn't respond. The second week of August, I drove to Lance's office to surprise him. It was a Thursday, around 7:30 p.m. I told the kids I was running an errand. I brought coffee for both of us, 2 cups in a carrier, the kind of gesture I'd made hundreds of times in 12 years of marriage. The security guard in the lobby looked at me with an expression I'll remember for a long time. Blank, then careful. He said Lance had left at 5. He said, "And I want to be exact here, Mr. Roan doesn't typically stay past 5 on Thursdays. He hasn't had evening meetings in this building for as long as I've been here." The guard had been there 4 years. I sat in my car in the parking garage for a few minutes. Then I drove to Gloria Voss's apartment on North Halsted Street. I'd found her address in Mia's school directory. She'd listed it because she ran art workshops from home on Saturdays. I hadn't planned to go there. Or maybe I had. I'm still not sure. His car was in her guest parking spot, space 2G. I sat across the street for 3 hours. When I got home, the kids were asleep. sleep. I sat in the kitchen. I didn't sleep. The next day I confronted Lance. I told him I knew he hadn't been at the office on Thursday nights. I told him I knew where he'd been. I told him I knew about Gloria Voss. He didn't flinch, not once. He didn't even look uncomfortable. He said, I was going to tell you. He said he had developed feelings for Gloria over the past several months. He said this was something that had grown naturally out of a friendship. And then, this is the part I was not prepared for, he said I should consider being grateful. He said, Gloria makes me happy. When I'm happy, I'm a better version of myself. When I'm a better version of myself, I'm a better father. He said I should be grateful he'd found her. I asked how long. He said 6 months, since May. Since the school welcome party where I had personally introduced them. I had shaken her hand. I had told her Mia loved her class. I had offered to bring her a coffee from the refreshment table. I want to describe what happened next carefully, because I think this is where the story stops being about a cheating husband and starts being about something more specific, something I think people need to understand. Lance didn't hide. That's what I mean. Most people, when they're caught doing something wrong, instinctively minimize, deny, retreat. Lance didn't do any of that. He expanded, as if being discovered was simply the next phase of a plan he'd already made. Within 2 weeks of my confrontation, Gloria began appearing at events she had no business attending. She came to Jake's soccer game on a Saturday morning in September. She wore a cream-colored dress with a slit in it, the kind of thing you might wear to a nice restaurant in the evening, not to stand on a suburban field at 9 a.m. She stayed close to Lance throughout the game. She kept touching his arm, his shoulder, his back, small touches, continuous, territorial. When Jake scored his first goal of the season, he'd been working on his left foot shot all summer. He looked up from the field the way kids do when they want to find their parents in the crowd. He found them. He found Lance kissing Gloria. Jake didn't celebrate. He just stood there. His arms dropped to his sides, and he stood in the middle of the field while his teammates ran toward him. His coach, a man named Daniel Prieto, told me about this afterward. He said he noticed because Jake usually pumped his fist. He said Jake just went quiet. Lance didn't notice any of this. Or he noticed, and it didn't register as something that mattered. The following week, Lance announced that Gloria would be joining family dinners every Friday evening. He phrased it as information, not a request. When I told him that was not going to happen, that these were dinners in our home, with our children, and that was not a reasonable thing to ask, he said, you don't really get a vote on this. Our marriage has been settling for years. Gloria represents something different. Gloria came to the first Friday dinner. She sat in my chair. I don't know if she knew which one was mine, or if Lance told her, or if it was pure chance. She sat in my chair and she ate the food I'd made, and she talked over Mia twice. When Mia mentioned that she'd been working on a drawing of our dog, Gloria smiled and said, sometimes change is good for everyone. She said it directly to Mia, to an 8-year-old. Lance turned to Mia and said, be respectful. I planted a recorder on the counter that night. Not for the dinner. I placed it after dinner, when the kids had gone upstairs and Lance and I were alone in the kitchen. I had purchased it 2 weeks earlier. I'd been waiting for the right moment. I'd been advised, quietly, by a friend who had been through her own divorce, that in Illinois, one-party consent applied to recordings. That meant I could record any conversation I was a participant in. I made sure I was a participant. That recorder sat on the counter for the next 6 weeks. I moved it as needed. I was careful. I was patient. That recorder is why things ended the way they did. The incident that broke something permanent was Jake's 10th birthday. I had planned a trampoline party. 32 kids from his class, a cake shaped like a soccer ball, a DJ who also did party games. Jake had been talking about it since August. He'd written a guest list in his school notebook. Lance announced 3 days before the party that the plans had changed. He and Gloria had decided that Jake was at an age where he needed more culturally enriching experiences. They had booked tickets to a special exhibit at the Art Institute, French Impressionism, with a guided tour. He said this like he was doing Jake a favor, like he had thought carefully about what Jake needed and arrived at a superior conclusion. Jake went to the museum. He didn't have a choice. Lance picked him up from school that Friday and drove him directly there. 32 kids went to the trampoline park without him. I sat in our kitchen and made 32 phone calls explaining that the party had been relocated and apologizing for the late notice. I lied. I said Jake had come down with something. At the museum, Jake stood in front of 19th century paintings, while Gloria lectured him about brushstroke technique and the role of light in post-Barbizon pastoral scenes. He was 10 years old. He had never expressed any interest in French Impressionism. He stood there and listened and didn't say much, from what Lance told me afterward, almost proudly. Jake cried himself to sleep that night. I heard him. I went into his room and sat on the edge of his bed, and he turned toward the wall, and I sat there with my hand on his back until he went quiet. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. That was a Thursday. That night I wrote 12 pages in a spiral notebook by hand, sitting at the kitchen table after midnight. Every incident I could document, in chronological order, with dates and names and specific details. Every Thursday night logged from May through October, every soccer game missed, every school conference Lance hadn't attended, every art show where Mia had waited by the door for him and he hadn't come, the birthday, the Friday dinners, every instance of Gloria entering spaces she hadn't been invited into. I photographed Lance's work calendar from the company portal. The scheduling system required a login, and I used the household account Lance had given me years ago for shared calendar access. The calendar showed 0 Thursday evening meetings from May through October. I saved screenshots with the portal's official header and timestamp visible. I printed them. The following Monday, I called Jillian Acker. Jillian was a family law attorney in the Chicago metropolitan area. I'd been given her name by the same friend who had mentioned the recording law. What I knew about her going in: she was expensive, she specialized in complex custody disputes, and she had a reputation for being methodical in a way that made opposing counsel uncomfortable. She wasn't aggressive in the courtroom in the obvious way. She was precise. She prepared longer than anyone else, and she moved when she was ready. She sat with me for 2 hours on a Tuesday afternoon in her office on Michigan Avenue on the 14th floor with a view I barely registered. I told her everything. I handed her the 12 pages. I described the recorder. I mentioned the school portal calendar. When I finished, she put her pen down on the table and said, "We can protect your children. Not, you have a great case. Not, he's going to regret this. Just that. We can protect your children." I decided in that moment that she was exactly the right person for this. She referred me to a colleague named Curtis Walker, a licensed clinical psychologist who specialized in working with children navigating parental affairs and custody disruption. I made an appointment for Jake first. Jake had 3 sessions with Curtis before I asked to see anything. After the 3rd session, Curtis showed me a drawing Jake had made during their 2nd meeting. It was a picture of our family, 4 figures. Lance and Gloria were on one side of the page. Jake and Mia and I were on the other side. Between them, Jake had drawn a thick black line. He had gone over and over it with the marker, pressing hard until it tore slightly through the paper. Curtis said Jake had done that without prompting. He said, "He's been carrying this for a while." I went home and I sat in my car in the driveway for 20 minutes. Then I went inside. 3 weeks later, Lance announced that Gloria would be moving in permanently. He used the word permanently. He said he had found an arrangement that worked and he intended to continue it. When I told him that we were still legally married and that this was still jointly our home and that the children who lived in it still needed some baseline of stability, he said I was resisting change out of ego and that I needed to evolve my thinking. I called Jillian the next morning. She said, "This is perfect for our case." I spent the next 4 weeks moving things out quietly. Small loads at night while Lance and Gloria were out or asleep. Jake's soccer trophies, Mia's art portfolios, the photograph albums, the documents from our fireproof lockbox, Lance's financial records from the years before we were married, which I had organized and scanned early in the marriage at his request, and which lived in a shared drive I still had access to. Certain things that were mine, certain things that were the children's. The morning I left, I put the divorce petition on the kitchen counter. I set it next to his coffee maker where he would see it immediately. I put a note underneath it. "We're done. Contact me through Jillian's office only." I took the kids to my sister Renata's house in Evanston. Renata had a guest suite on the 2nd floor and a golden retriever named Pepper that Mia immediately claimed as her own. Jake asked if we could get McDonald's for dinner, and I said yes without thinking, and he seemed to take that as confirmation that things might actually be okay. Lance called Jillian's office within 90 minutes of finding the papers. Jillian told me he threatened to report me for parental abduction. He said I had taken the children without his consent. Jillian told him, calmly, that the children were with the parent who had attended every school conference, every pediatric appointment, every game and recital for the past 7 years, and that she would be in touch regarding scheduling. He hung up. He tried calling me directly from several different numbers throughout that afternoon and into the evening. I responded to none of them. I had nothing left to say to him that wasn't better said in a courtroom. The mediation session was held in February, in a conference room at a neutral law office in the Loop, 14 weeks after I had left, long enough for things to settle into shape. Jillian had prepared what she called a documentation package. The 12 pages, organized and indexed, the school portal calendar screenshots, Curtis Walker's formal psychological assessment of both children, which included clinical observations, notes from therapy sessions, and his professional opinion regarding what custody arrangement would best serve their developmental stability. A written statement from Daniel Preto, Jake's soccer coach, describing what he had witnessed at the September game. A letter from the principal at Mia's school documenting that Lance had not appeared at a single parent conference during the current academic year, and that Gloria Voss had appeared twice, without authorization, as though representing the family. Financial records documenting disproportionate household expenditure during the affair period, including restaurant charges, hotel bookings, and gift purchases that had cleared our joint account, and the recording. Lance sat across the conference table with his attorney. Lance looked tired, and for the first time in as long as I could remember, uncertain. Not remorseful. Uncertain. There's a difference. Remorse acknowledges someone else. Uncertainty is still about yourself. The mediator, a woman named Sandra Feld, who had been doing this work for 22 years, reviewed the documentation package. She asked Lance a series of questions about his involvement in the children's schooling, their medical care, their extracurricular lives. His answers were vague and increasingly qualified. His attorney interjected twice. The answers got shorter. Then Jillian set a small digital voice recorder on the table. She pressed play. The room was very quiet. My voice came first. I was asking Lance about Jake's birthday, about the museum, about the 32 kids who went to a trampoline park without him while he stood in front of French paintings. Lance's voice came next. Gloria is more important than the kids right now because she makes me the man who can provide for them. The recording was 22 seconds long. Jillian let the silence after it run for almost 10 full seconds before she said anything. Sandra Feld looked at Lance. She said, "I'd like to give you the opportunity to explain how that statement sounds better in context." Lance opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at his attorney. His attorney shook shook his head, barely perceptibly. Lance opened his mouth again. Nothing came. Sandra Feld picked up her pen. She made a note. She said, "All right." In that silence, the pen scratching, the distant sound of traffic 20 floors below, I watched Lance understand what 6 months of choices had cost him. And then he reached for the pen to sign the proposed custody arrangement. What he did in that moment, I was not prepared for. He signed it without a word. No argument. No counter-proposal. No last attempt to negotiate a better position. He picked up the pen and he signed the document that gave me primary physical custody of both children, with his access scheduled to supervised visits twice monthly for the first 6 months pending review. He signed it and he set the pen down and he picked up his jacket from the back of the chair and he walked out of the conference room without speaking to me. Not anger, not a threat, not even a parting shot. He just left. Jillian said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "That's unusual." Her voice was even, but I could hear the note of surprise underneath it. I found out later, through his attorney's communication with Jillian, that Lance's financing on a large development project had collapsed during the weeks leading up to mediation. 2 of his primary investors had pulled out following a dispute over project mismanagement. The details were complicated and still partially unresolved, but the practical effect was that Lance was carrying a debt load he hadn't fully disclosed during our asset negotiations, and he was in no position, financially, professionally, emotionally, to sustain a protracted custody battle. The swagger had run out of room. Gloria, I was told by a mutual acquaintance, moved out of the house within 3 weeks of the mediation. The acquaintance said Lance had come home one afternoon to find that she'd taken most of what she'd brought and left a note. I don't know what the note said. I didn't ask. The immediate aftermath was difficult in ways I had anticipated and in ways I hadn't. My mother took Lance's side at first. She had always liked him. She'd said at our wedding that she felt like she was gaining a son, and she found it difficult to reconcile the Lance she believed she knew with what I was telling her. We had 2 difficult phone calls in February and March. She said things that hurt. I tried to remember that she was working with incomplete information and that her grief over the marriage ending was real, even if her handling of it was wrong. By April, after a long conversation with Renata, and after Lance had missed 2 consecutive scheduled visits with the children and offered explanations that didn't hold up, my mother came around. She didn't announce it dramatically. She just started calling more. She started asking what the kids needed. Small adjustments. That's how these things usually change. Not in a single moment, but in small, quiet increments that accumulate into something different. Renata's support was unwavering from the beginning. She let us stay in her guest suite for 6 weeks while I finalized the lease on a 3-bedroom apartment in Rogers Park. She fed my children and walked Mia to school twice a week and helped Jake practice his penalty kicks in the backyard in March when the ground was still half frozen. I will owe her something I can't fully name for the rest of my life. There were unexpected people. Daniel Prieto, Jake's soccer coach, reached out in March to say that Jake seemed lighter. He said, "I don't know what changed, but he's celebrating again." He sent a video he'd taken at practice. Jake scoring a goal and doing a ridiculous little dance, and all the other kids laughing with him. I watched it 4 times. The school principal sent a card. It said she had been rooting for us. I don't know exactly what she knew or how she knew it. I appreciated that she said something. The grief caught me in unexpected places. I went through a period in March and April where I would find old photographs, not the album photographs, which I deliberately kept in storage, but random ones that surfaced, on my phone, in a drawer, one behind the refrigerator, curled at the edges, from a vacation we'd taken in 2019 to the Outer Banks. Lance was laughing at something. Jake was sitting on his shoulders. I looked young. We all looked young. I didn't throw the photograph away. I put it in a folder in the top of my closet. I don't know exactly why. I think there's something dishonest about pretending the whole thing was always wrong. 12 years is long enough to accumulate genuine things alongside the eventual failure. I'm still sorting out which was which. What I know is that I spent 6 months being very still while something moved underneath me. I watched, I documented. I didn't act from anger. I acted from clarity, which is different and harder. Anger wants to be seen. Clarity just needs to be effective. The custody arrangement was reviewed at 6 months in August. Lance's access was expanded to unsupervised visits, alternating weekends. He had entered individual therapy, which the court had recommended and which he had, to his credit, actually done. The visits began slowly and tentatively. Jake came home from the first one quiet, but not the same quiet as before. A different kind. Thinking, not shutting down. Mia drew a picture after the second visit. I asked her what it was. She said, "Daddy's new apartment. He has a plant now." She showed me. There was a small green shape in the corner of the room. I told her the plant was a nice detail. She nodded seriously and went back to drawing. I'm writing this from the kitchen table in our apartment in Rogers Park. It's May now. Mia's backpack is by the door. Jake's soccer cleats are on the mat, muddy from yesterday's practice, which he will be annoyed at me for mentioning. The window over the sink here also looks out over something. A narrow backyard with a garden I have not yet figured out what to do with. Last weekend, Jake suggested we plant tomatoes. I said we could try. What I want to say to whoever is reading this is something about the difference between patience and passivity. I was patient for almost 12 years. I absorbed things. I adjusted my perceptions to fit the narrative I'd been handed. I told myself I was being understanding. I told myself marriage is long and complicated and requires tolerance. I was confusing patience with disappearance. The 6 months I spent building the case were different. That was patience with a direction. I waited because I was preparing, not because I had no options. The The notebook, the recorder, the attorney, the psychologist, each thing in its place at the right time without showing my hand. I don't say this with pride exactly. I say it because I think there's something important in the distinction, especially for anyone who recognizes themselves in this story. The title of what I went through, the sentence Lance said, the one that clarified everything, was that his mistress made him a better father. He believed it when he said it. That's the part that took me longest to process. He wasn't performing. He wasn't trying to wound me. He had genuinely constructed a reality in which this was logical, in which his happiness was the primary resource from which everything else in the family flowed, and anything that served his happiness was therefore, by extension, good for everyone else. Children know when they're not the point. Jake knew. Mia knew in her own way. Kids can tolerate a lot of things. They can tolerate tension and conflict and imperfect parents and difficult circumstances. What they can't tolerate without damage is being rendered irrelevant in the mind of someone who is supposed to love them unconditionally. That line Jake drew across the page, over and over until the paper tore. That was him saying something he didn't have words for yet. I held on to that drawing for a long time. I still have it. I keep it in the same folder as the Outer Banks photograph. Both of them feel like evidence of something true. Some mornings I still wake up and the first thing I feel is grief. Not for Lance specifically. For the version of the future I'd assumed was mine. The house. The intact family. The version of the story where things stayed together. That grief is quieter now. It comes in and I let it sit for a minute, and then I get up and I make coffee, and Mia comes downstairs with her hair still tangled and asks me what's for breakfast, and Jake comes in a minute later looking for his shin guards, and the apartment gets loud, and that's enough. That's actually more than enough. Some things were lost that can't be recovered. I know that. I'm not trying to wrap this in a neat ending. But what I built in those 6 months, those 12 pages, those documented dates, those quiet choices, that wasn't just a legal case. It was proof to myself that I could see clearly when I needed to, that I could move with precision when everything else felt like chaos, that I could love my children with enough steadiness that they could feel it, even in the middle of the worst year. That's what I spent 6 months quietly building, and that part, at least, held.